Welcome, everybody. My name is Tim Profeta. I am a senior fellow at the Nicholas Institute and had the honor and pleasure of being a co-author on the paper we'll be discussing today with my colleagues Tyler Norris, Dalia Patiño-Echeverri, and Adam Cowie-Haskell, two of whom you'll also hear from today. Welcome to our 1-hour webinar discussing the paper. And I do want to say two things in terms of housekeeping. Up front, one is that you probably got the same notice we all did, but this webinar is being recorded. Second is we do want to present on the paper, but also leave room at the back end for questions and answers. Our colleagues will be going through those questions. If you put them in through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, don't use the chat function. We won't see them there. Put them through the Q&A function. We'll try and get to as many of them as we can. But again, welcome. I am pleased to be here and excited to talk about the paper today. Jeremy, I believe you were on the slides. Can you forward slides for me? Could you forward slides to the introduction slide, please? And actually, two more slides, please. Just a quick moment. As I know, my name is Tim Profeta. I'm the founding director and the senior fellow at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. The Institute was founded in 2005 to make knowledge that Duke University can create and assemble and bring to the people who are making policy important decisions outside the academic sector. Today's paper is really a key example of the sort of analysis that we like to do at the Institute. We have a really central challenge that we're hearing both in the public and the private sector of how to address load growth. We were able to pull together with colleagues of work here to try and make sure that large load flexibility is part of the toolkit we look at as in policy positions. We try to address this challenge. We are really pleased to work with Dalia and Tyler from the Grace Lab, which you also see on the screen, which is an applied research institution at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke, really focused on the challenges of the electric sector in meeting our energy needs and also environmental challenges at the same time. Today, we're going to talk about the paper that the three of us, plus our colleague Adam Cowie-Haskell, published just recently on load growth and large load flexibility as a possible solution or part of the solution set for addressing our load growth needs in the United States. Next slide, please. This paper rose out of actually a conversation that Tyler and I had with some commissioners recently in a project at the Nicholas Institute to work directly with utility commissioners, where the commissioner noted that they really had not been aware of how much flexibility might be possible from these loads as they came onto the grid. It sort of asked us the question, well, really, what's the capability here? How much possibility is there, which led us to do the evaluation we'll talk about today. And this is really, as I should note, a first order estimate. We at the back of the paper talk about a lot of the limitations of the analysis, but it did give us a very good, quick look at the potential there might be for headroom in our existing infrastructure that could absorb some of our load growth. I think, to some degree, we were trying to figure out if there was gold in the hills, and it seems like there's gold in the hills and that we should be hunting for it in terms of our capabilities here. Next slide, please. Very quickly to set the table, I think almost everybody who would join this would be aware that load growth is really in a collision course now with the resource constraints of our energy system. We have major load growth projections coming in, first from the electrification of other sectors, from the reshoring and manufacturing that we've been seeing over the last 3 to 4 years, and then sort of it really intensified with the AI revolution and the hyperscaling of data centers to service it. At the same time, we have constraints on getting electricity on the grid to service this. We have challenges from interconnection, from transmission, from setting the infrastructure we need. And so, I think we come to this question with the view that we need every tool in the toolkit to be able to address this problem. And particularly, we need to find tools that can tolerate the delays that we may see in sort of the longer term challenges that we see from siting and interconnection and the like. Next slide, please. And we particularly want to look at load flexibility as possibly offering such a sort of near-term solution, a place that we can use the headroom that we see in the existing infrastructure to be able to serve the needs and the economic growth that we want in this country without being fully challenged by some of the constraints that I just discussed. This is an idea that we've seen a number of other experts beginning to look at as a possible near-term solution as well. Here we're flagging examples from the DOE and EPRI just in the last year, talking about how this sort of flexibility can help support and stabilize the grid while we service our load growth. So that's our background for today. To where we started from. Now I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Tyler Norris to sort of talk about the analysis that we conducted to interrogate the question. Tyler?
Thanks, Tim. Great to be with everyone today. My name's Tyler Norris. I'm a JB Duke Fellow and PhD student at the Nicholas School at Duke University. I bring a little over 10 years of experience in the electric power sector to my research and Dalia Patiño-Echeverri's lab. We wanted to start by providing some broader context around the planning and operation of the electric power system. A key metric that we examine in the paper is the load factor. And the load factor is essentially a given system's average utilization rate. It's calculated as the ratio of a system's average demand over its peak demand. And we can look at this for each balancing authority. Our study assessed the 22 largest balancing authorities in the US, all of which are indicated here. We found that between 2016 to 2024, which is the available hourly load data from EIA, that the average and the median load factor for each of these systems, or for the collection of these systems, was 53%, and it ranged between 43 to 61%. We would generally expect that load factors would be higher in the summer and or in the winter, depending on the system, which you can also see here. And we found that winter load factors on average were lower than summer load factors. Another way of looking at this is in terms of the load duration curve. And here we're looking at 7 separate load duration curves for each of the ISO RTOs. You can find the same curve for the rest of the balancing authorities in the report. The y-axis on the left represents the realized demand as a share of each system's maximum peak between 2016 to 2024. And these are all standardized for comparative purposes. And the x-axis on the bottom represents the share of hours during which each system experienced a given demand level over this period. And what we can see here is that the highest demand volume on each system, indicated in the upper left, occurs during a very small share of the hours. The general reason, which is intuitive, is that the highest demand levels occur during occasional extreme weather events at the height of summer or winter, depending on the system. And this means that during most hours of the year, the system is underutilized. In other words, most of the time, the installed generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure is only partially used. And a key point is that our systems are primarily planned around these peaks. And this is true, of course, for capacity expansion planning, but it's also true for interconnection studies. And so when a new load or a generator is studied for grid interconnection, it's assumed that it will inject or withdraw at its maximum rated capacity during the most extreme system peaks, also subject to a variety of contingencies. And this critical assumption is often a primary factor in driving the need for new generation and transmission capacity. When we consider this in the context of new load, we can think about a spectrum of flexibility for the new load. On one end of the spectrum, here on the left, a new load could be inflexible, and an inflexible load that increases the system's absolute peak can drive substantial additions for generation and transmission capacity. On the other end of the spectrum, a new load could be flexible, and if they're flexible enough to avoid a high coincident load factor with the system peak, they may be able to mitigate their contribution to demand during the highest demand hours, and thus fit within the system's existing headroom. In both cases, the load would tend to increase system utilization, but of course, if a load does not contribute to higher peaks and therefore require more transmission and generation and transmission infrastructure, then it can increase the existing system utilization in a way that may benefit the existing ratepayers. And then in the context of grid interconnection studies, to the extent that a new load can temporarily curtail its power consumption from the grid during peak stress periods, it may be able to defer or even avoid certain grid upgrades. And this appears to be sort of the tip of the spear in terms of some of the interest that's emerging from large loads, is this exchange of flexibility in exchange for faster interconnection. And this could end up being arranged in different ways. In some cases, it may only be on an interim basis or a provisional basis until the firm capacity is available to provide firm service. And that's similar to what we call provisional interconnection service on the generator side. But it may be the case that some of these more flexible loads may prefer to maintain a non-firm interconnection service throughout the lifetime of their operation. And that option would resemble some of the existing interconnection services that are available for generators, or what was designated as Energy Resource Interconnection Service by FERC, established under Order 2003. These issues raise increasingly consequential considerations today for regulators. The case of Virginia, of course, is well known, given the very high concentration of data center additions there. But these issues are arising in a variety of other jurisdictions, many of which that have caught headlines. In Ohio, AEP, after confirming 5 gigawatts of new data centers, received an additional request for 30 gigawatts of data center capacity, and therefore implemented a temporary moratorium on data center requests in 2023. They recently achieved a settlement agreement with consumer advocates that calls for longer contracts, load ramping schedules, minimum demand charges, and collateral for service for data centers above a certain size threshold. Similar issues have recently come up in Georgia, where 7.3 gigawatts of large load customers committed to receive electric service from Georgia Power, which in response, the Georgia Public Service Commission implemented changes to customer contract provisions, which include allowing the utility to seek longer contracts and minimum billing for cost recovery. And then a similar case in Indiana, where data center service requests represent nearly 160% increase in the peak load for Indiana Michigan Power over the next 6 years. And some stakeholders there propose firewalling the associated cost of service for those data centers from the rest of the rate base. And these are just 3 select examples of phenomena that is growing in a variety of jurisdictions and presenting unique challenges to the regulators. And we think, these examples underscore the significance of exploring how flexible load can potentially mitigate these peak increases and optimize system utilization in a way that may be able to benefit the existing ratepayers and also reduce the urgency for costly and time-consuming capacity additions. Our report characterizes 4 general types of load flexibility. And so these range from on-site power and storage, which of course could be battery storage, it could be different forms of renewable power generation, or other forms of generation. We have seen behind the meter natural gas become a growing area of interest. And of course, many of these data centers do have on-site diesel, which has been constrained in its ability to operate due to various environmental restrictions. The category of temporal flexibility, which is essentially scheduling computational loads before or after these periods of the highest system stress, which we also demonstrate are generally relatively short in duration. The average was approximately 2 hours for most of the scenarios, although they can, of course, be higher than that depending on the system conditions. The category of spatial flexibility, which is an area of developing interest for hyperscalers, which is distributing computational workloads across one or potentially multiple data centers in different geographic locations. And then the fourth category, of course, is the ability to simply reduce operations during defined periods. This may be less appealing for certain data centers, but for other computational loads, it may be more manageable. And we have seen that to be the case with a variety of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency computational loads, which we also highlight. And so the general thesis and what we discuss in the report is that there are 3 major trends that may be able to facilitate more flexible operations among the newest generation of data centers that are more specialized for artificial intelligence workloads. The first is the evolving load profile of these newer data centers, and specifically the workloads relating to training the AI models are understood to be more tolerant of delay and thus more able to be scheduled during defined periods, especially as compared to the legacy computational loads, which were primarily real-time and delay intolerant services. The second category is the evolving operational capabilities of the data centers, specifically in the 2 realms we just discussed around temporal flexibility and spatial flexibility. And in addition, the ability to have cleaner on-site power resources arguably enables more flexibility because those generators or that backup storage may be capable of running more often as compared to the legacy tier 2 diesel generators. And then the third trend here is changing market conditions. And of course, this transition from a low to high growth environment, we're seeing constrained supply side market conditions that raise costs and lead times for interconnecting the large flexible loads, especially when speed to market is paramount for many of the AI developers. And this is taking shape in a variety of realms, including protracted interconnection queues and other supply chain bottlenecks. The other key market trend is, of course, just simply the reduction in costs and the increase in capabilities for a variety of distributed energy resources compared to the past. And then the third factor under market conditions here is this growing concentration that we're seeing of computational load in co-located or hyperscale data centers, which lends scale and specialization to more sophisticated data center operators. We highlight a few select examples of implementation of large load flexibility, and in particular computational load flexibility in the report. One example, of course, is Google data centers have been documented as participating in various demand response programs in North America and in Europe, that they are implementing carbon-aware temporal workload shifting, as well as geospatial workload shifting. There are documented examples of Enel X supporting data center demand response participation and transitioning to on-site batteries and other on-site generators in order to island within minutes. Veris is a new company spun out of Sidewalk Labs, and the premise of its business model appears to be developing flexible data centers with different architecture and leveraging more distributed resources to offer flexibility. Enchanted Rock has supported hyperscalers and installing primarily on-site gas generators for data centers that do offer flexibility. And so it is important to note that flexibility is not necessarily favoring any particular technology type or another. There are a variety of different types of technologies that may support large loads in offering this type of flexibility. And then on the earlier stage side, there are startups like Emerald AI, which are developing software with advanced computational resource management for more precise demand response. And then for the system operators and utilities, these examples thus far appear to be a bit more limited, but two that we do highlight that ERCOT did implement an interim interconnection process to allow loads to be studied in a more flexible way in exchange for faster interconnection and what they call controllable load resources. They also established a large flexible task force for large loads. And then PG&E did release a pilot program in late 2024 called FlexConnect, and its purpose is similarly to provide faster interconnection for large loads in exchange for flexibility. So now we'll turn to the analysis that we performed. This will be a summary and will necessarily omit some details and nuance. And so we encourage you to reference the report for specific figures. This is a flowchart that summarizes our method. We won't try to walk through each of these steps right now, but we thought it would be helpful to provide a high-level overview. You can see in the top left that the process starts with each individual balancing authority. The data was compiled on an hourly basis for each of the available 9 years. This is the extent of full years of hourly load data that's available from EIA. We performed a variety of cleaning methods for this data that is documented, I believe, in Appendix B of the report. And then with this final hourly load data set, we then identified the seasonal peak threshold. And so in the next couple slides, we will discuss the identification of these peak thresholds and how they were applied, and then how the goal seek was performed to identify the applicable load accommodation capacity for each curtailment target. So a key aspect of the method was identifying the maximum realized peaks for each balancing authority in the summer and in the winter. And so what you see here is an illustrative example for PJM, including 9 years of hourly load data, which here is represented as the single highest demand value for each day, just for visualization purposes. You can see in the upper middle portion of this figure where the maximum summer peak is determined over these 9 years, and on the left-hand side where the winter peak is determined. And the basic understanding here is that each balancing authority develops resource plans that are capable of supporting these peaks. On top of these existing system peaks, there is also a reserve margin of generating capacity that is available. So we are discounting the reserve margin that is available on top of these existing realized peaks. These thresholds form the basis for the calculation of curtailment. And when we shift here to the next slide, we'll provide a visual illustration of the method. And so for consistency here, again, we show PJM solely for illustrative purposes during a week in January 2024. The y-axis on the left indicates the system-wide load. The x-axis represents the date and the time. And so for each balancing authority, we start with the existing demand curve, as well as the identified seasonal maximum peak threshold. We then add constant load. It was constant in all hours, illustrated here by the green line. And this is just for illustrative purposes. The increment in this case is 10 gigawatts of additional load. And then the method is to calculate the amount of load that's in excess of the applicable seasonal peak, and then aggregate each hour of curtailed load of the new load across all hours in the year for each of the years of hourly data that's available, and then to average the curtailment rates, average the volume of new load addition such that the average curtailment rate is equivalent to a predefined set of curtailment targets. And we chose these targets to be relatively consistent with existing curtailment requirements and demand response programs across the United States. We cite a couple examples in the Western markets of 2% annual curtailment. We initially looked at this at a 1% annual average curtailment rate and a 5% as an upper end sort of extreme limit for calibration. The amount of headroom was so substantial that we thought it would be valuable to run at 0.5% average annual curtailment, as well as 0.25% average annual curtailment. And just in case this point isn't clear, the percentage represents for each load the amount of total curtailed megawatt hours divided by the new load's maximum potential annual consumption. And again, in this case, it was assumed that the new loads were constant. And just for everyone's reference, the full mathematical formulation for this goal-seek function is presented in Appendix C of the report. So the results of this analysis are presented here. For a simplification of visual presentation, what's presented here are the results solely for the curtailment rate of 0.5% for the new load. We term this curtailment-enabled headroom. And you can see that in this case, the amount of available headroom in aggregate is 98 gigawatts across the 22 balancing authorities. And I should note that the 22 balancing authorities represent 95% of the aggregated US peak load. So it's essentially a proxy for the available curtailment-enabled headroom on a national basis. When the load curtailment rate is reduced to 0.25%, there's 76 gigawatts of headroom available across the 22 balancing authorities. If it's increased to 1%, that available headroom rose to 126 gigawatts in total. And then if it was increased all the way to 5%, the available headroom, according to this method, would be approximately 215 gigawatts. And just for orientation, the existing aggregated national summer peak load is approximately 760 gigawatts. So at the 0.25% curtailment level, that would enable, according to this method, approximately a 10% increase in US load. To also visualize the relationship between the load additions and the curtailment rate, we also calculated the curtailment for small incremental load additions. In this case, it was an increment of 0.25% of each system's peak load. And so you can see that illustrated here again, just for illustrated purposes for PJM. There's a similar chart presented for each of the balancing authorities in Appendix A of the report. But this plot captures the year-by-year variability in the demand patterns, and then it indicates the average of these years, which was the basis for, the average figure that's presented elsewhere in the report. And so you can see in this case that at a curtailment rate of 0.25%, as indicated on the left-hand y-axis, that the load addition in PJM is it's at approximately 13,000 megawatts, and that it increases incrementally following an exponential or a quadratic trend up to approximately 23,000 megawatts at a load curtailment rate of 1%. And this curve generally aligns with our expectation that the curtailment rate increases more sharply as the load addition increases. We also analyzed the hours of curtailment that would occur on average for each individual balancing authority, but then aggregated across the balancing authorities. What we found is that a large majority of the curtailment hours retained most of the new load. And so just to zoom in here to illustrate this, if we look at the 0.25% curtailment limit in the bottom left of this chart, what we see is that on average, there would be 85 hours of curtailment in an average year for the new load, when some amount of curtailment of the new load would occur. But in 73 of those 85 hours, at least 50% of the new load is retained. And similarly, for 50 of those 85 hours, at least 75% of the new load is retained. And then in 24 of the hours, at least 90% of that load is retained. So on average, nearly 90% of the hours during which load curtailment is required retain at least half of the new load, and then 60% retain at least 75%, and about 30% retained at least 90% of the load. And finally, we looked at the duration of the curtailment events on average. And so what we mean by curtailment duration is the length of time that the new load is curtailed when a curtailment event occurs. And what we found is that the average duration was approximately 2 hours for the 0.25%, the 0.5%, and the 1% curtailment limit. It then increased more substantially up to 4.5 hours at the 5% curtailment limit. And you can see the average for each of the balancing authorities presented here. I'll note that we also explored in the report the relationship between the system load factor and the load accommodation capacity for each balancing authority. We decided not to go into that level of detail for the purposes of this presentation, but I wanted to flag it in case there's interest. So there's more detail on that topic that's contained in the report. And so with that, I will now turn it to Professor Dalia Patiño-Echeverri to talk about next steps.
Thank you, Tyler. Hello, everyone. My name is Dalia Patiño-Echeverri, Associate Professor at the Nicholas School of the Environment. And I'm going to talk about the next steps in this research. Next slide, please. As Tim mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this is a first order assessment of the capacity for serving new curtailable loads. So as a first order assessment, it has several limitations. And there are simplifications and methodological choices that were made that will, once removed, will reduce or increase our estimate of the available headroom, curtailment-enabled headroom. So on the left, we have the factors that may reduce our estimate of available headroom. That includes adding network constraints, adding the intertemporal constraints for the conventional generators, so accounting for minimum uptime, minimum downtime, ramp up capability, ramp down capabilities, and will probably reduce the available headroom estimate. It will also, if we account for any additional variability and any additional uncertainty in the load that is going to be served, this may also reduce available headroom estimate. And finally, if we consider non-constant load increases, as it was done in this first order assessment, then we may have an increase in curtailment as a percentage of served load. Maybe not as a percent, as an absolute megawatt hour curtailed, but yes, as a percentage of served load. On the right, we have the factors or the changes that we can make to this analysis that may increase available headroom estimate. The first one is that we may, instead of assuming that the capacity of the system is determined by the seasonal peak, we could assume that is determined by the seasonal peak plus some portion of the reserves, or the installed resource margin that all these systems have. They are all prepared to serve their highest historical peak plus a percentage, maybe 16, 17%. We are not counting any of that. So that would increase the available headroom estimate. If we had lower expected system peaks, that would also increase the available headroom estimate. And if we had non-constant load shape, although that would increase the curtailment as a percentage of served load, that would reduce the absolute megawatt hour of curtailed load. Next slide, please. So to address these limitations, we are going to continue this analysis and recalculate this curtailment-enabled headroom by simulating the scheduling and dispatch of all the electricity generating units, the flexible demands, the energy storage, accounting for the generating units' technical and intertemporal constraints, accounting for the topology and capacity of all these electric power transmission network, and then looking at different scenarios and characterizations of the new load. What is variability, uncertainty, and responsiveness or flexibility? We are going to do this, next slide, please, with a modeling framework that we've developed in the Grace Lab. It begins with a characterization of the balancing authority, just representing all the resources, the supply resources, the demand resources, the transmission grid, that's on the left, on the top left. It also requires characterizing the new loads, how are they geographically distributed, what are their temporal patterns, and the responsiveness, both in terms of what are the technical capabilities for responsiveness, but what are the costs. And then characterizing all the uncertainty, both the weather-based uncertainty affecting resources on the supply and demand side, and also the intrinsic risk that comes with each of them. Characterizing this uncertainty in a framework of probabilistic forecasts that gives us numerous scenarios with their probabilities of happening. And then using for the scheduling, using a unit commitment model. We have different flavors of this model. Can be deterministic, can be stochastic, may have risk adjustment if stochastic, may have a horizon that looks just in the day ahead for the next 24 or 36 hours, may have weekly horizons for places with nuclear plants and long duration storage. And then the economic dispatch, which is very similar, and it can be myopic, just looking at just the upcoming periods or looking ahead several periods of time, using our libraries approach for solving these problems faster. And then the outcome expected is different results per scenario considered, per characterization of the loads, and per balancing authority. So that next slide, please. So just to conclude, we have shown that with this first order assessment, we can identify the significant capacity to accommodate new load with very modest curtailment. Second, we can start a conversation about near-term strategies, tapping into this load flexibility so that we can expedite the interconnection of these new loads, mitigate costs, and improve system utilization. And third, we are, of course, committed to refining this headroom estimate. If you have ideas, if you want to help us fund this endeavor, talk to us. If you have questions about our data, that also is going to be welcome. With this, I'm going to pass it again to Tyler to begin our Q&A section of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia. Thanks to everyone for making it this far in the webinar. If you haven't already, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A portion of the Zoom. We already have a few, so we will go ahead and get started. We'll try to get to as many as we can. We may not be able to get to all of the questions, and so we're happy. We have a recording of the questions, and if possible, we'll try to follow up with you directly. And also, please do feel free to reach out to us if you'd like. I also note that the recording of this will be made available and posted online for reference. So our first question here, and we're actually going to have Tim address this one, is who are the relevant stakeholders for this analysis, and what do you expect they may do with these findings?
Thanks, and thanks for the question. As I sort of noted, I think we're really looking to use this analysis to inform the relevant decision makers regarding how we service loads. So that's the regulators at the state level, at the regional level, the sources of load, also the utilities, the federal energy policy makers overseeing the system. I think that's all relevant, but I think what we really want them to do is introduce processes to interrogate the use of this headroom in planning processes. Definitely want awareness of some of the pilot programs like the ones that PG&E and ERCOT have initiated that we mentioned. And then, possibly maybe motivation for regulators to open proceedings to explore recommendations for how they should potentially enable this approach, across their entire planning process.
Thanks, Tim. We have one more here that I can try to address. The question is, what are the policy barriers to trying flexible arrangements? Do PUCs, RTOs, and loads have the tools to enable it? And if not, what is missing? It's a great question. It's a big question. I'll mention a couple of aspects. So One challenge, of course, is that we do not have standardized interconnection procedures for large loads, and there's a good reason for this, right? These are considered retail and therefore subject to jurisdiction by the states and the state public utility commissions, unlike large generators. And so unlike large generators, right, we don't have these standardized sort of pro forma procedures and agreements, which go all the way back to, as I mentioned earlier, for a quarter of 2003, so now over 20 years. And one potential benefit of this is that it may allow for more experimentation at a state level, but it does contribute to a more balkanized environment. I'll note is interesting, actually just today, former Commissioner Allison Clements has an op-ed in Utility Dive with a co-author suggesting that there should be more standardization of large load interconnection. So it may be worth stakeholders and regulators considering their perspective. But this does introduce a challenge. So as Tim mentioned, we've seen some experimentation at the state level with specific utilities and system operators and ERCOT and some in California. I mean, one of the key barriers we heard from, as Tim mentioned earlier, from regulators is that they had not been informed that large load flexibility might be a capability and an option of interest. And so that's part of our hope, of course, with this analysis and this report, is to raise awareness and hopefully motivate additional consideration and an analysis. There's a lot to discuss in response to that, but I'll just mention two other things, which is that, for the data centers, it has been a very recent evolution in both the computational load profile and some of the operational capabilities that might better enable flexibility. And so a lot of this is quite new. And so it's understandable that many of us are getting up to speed on what is possible. And I think even many market participants that work with data centers directly are also getting up to speed because the capabilities have evolved so quickly. Let's see, I'll just start going through. So one question is, are curtailment events clustered around certain periods of times a day or month? As one would expect, of course, they are clustered primarily in the peak season, so summer and winter. Whether it's more concentrated in the summer or winter is actually directly correlated with the respective seasonal load factors for each system. It's actually in the report. This is part of that additional analysis that I mentioned. We look at this actually for each balancing authority and how its peak season's load factor is correlated with its load accommodation capacity and curtailment rate. And so you can see more there. I think generally, to the extent that it is more winter concentrated, you see it showing up more in the winter mornings in that 6 to 9 a.m. period. And then in the summer, as one would expect, you see it in the late afternoon and early evening, peak periods. One question is, of the described flexibility methods, which holds the most promise? It's a good question. I think the jury is potentially still out. I will say that based on some of the conversations that we've had around this report, there appears to be especially keen interest in leveraging on-site power and storage. That also aligns with, FERC's initiation of a workshop and a docket on co-location of large loads of generators last fall. And that's where we see a lot of the predominant market activity in terms of vendors, I think, interested in servicing some of the data centers. It's certainly the option that may contribute the least to potential disruptions, right, and sort of computational load. That said, it's been very interesting to see the development, as mentioned, of both temporal and the spatial flexibility capabilities and the evolution of some of these advanced computational resource management methods. And so I think we're starting to see more market activity on that front. And as mentioned earlier, starting to see new startup companies really going after this opportunity in a bigger way, including those like Emerald AI. So the jury still appears to be out. We do mention on the report that the interest in spatial flexibility is more developing. There's one hyperscaler that has appeared to lean into it more than others, but that might be characterized as one of the more advanced capabilities that hasn't necessarily seen substantial market penetration to date. Lots of good questions here. Is there information or data you could not access that would have made this a more complete analysis that you would like to have for a follow-on study? Really good question. I think it's no secret that publicly available data around data center operations is relatively limited for oftentimes understandable reasons. There are proprietary concerns. Some of these limitations were even faced by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in its congressionally mandated report on data center energy usage, which it published in December of 2024, and it also noted some limitations on data access. I'll say that as we go into the next order of our analysis here, a couple key questions have come up just in the past few weeks. One is better understanding the response times for some of these more flexible computational loads, understanding the expected load profile, and Dalia was talking about this, and we assumed constant load additions for purposes of simplification, but also because the available information on the expected daily and annual profile of the AI specialized data centers is still limited, and even in terms of aggregate utilization rates, it appears limited, and we've seen a variety of different assumptions used even for aggregate utilization rates for even the AI specialized data centers. And on one extreme, some people seem to think that the chips are so valuable and expensive that we could see near 100% utilization rates, but based on the available data, it doesn't appear that we do see anything close to 100% utilization rates. But of course, most of the existing available data is for those data centers that aren't as AI specialized. So there are definitely some information gaps there that we hope to be able to bridge. Got about 5 minutes left. Maybe I'll, Dalia, not to put you on the spot, but I think this might be a great question that goes to some of what you were talking about. The question is, how might the increasing levels of variable renewable energy, i.e. wind and solar in the RTOs, put pressure on these models and also separately on market design?
That's an excellent question. Well, to the extent that this adds to uncertainty on load, so to the extent that this adds to the forecast error of load, and to the extent that this is coincident or not coincident with or how it relates to the temporal variability of the variable renewable energy, a new load is going to increase the need for reserves. It's going to increase the need for ramping capability. And so it's going to increase system costs unless it's curtailable at those times. And is needed to the cost of curtailing it is lower than the cost of responding to these variations in the required energy. So it's hard to say without doing the analysis, and that's where we need to get busy characterizing these different load profiles and different responsiveness types. So to understand what is the cost on the system, what is the incremental cost on the system, and what signals should be sent by regulators or markets for an efficient use of the available capacity.
Thanks, Dalia. Maybe I'll take probably one more question. We have just two minutes left here, and apologies to those we couldn't get to, but we really look forward to ongoing engagement with everyone. Please feel free to reach out. So the question is, how can load flexibility be translated into system planning processes like interconnection studies and resource adequacy studies that actually allows using the headroom on the system? So this is a really important point, and I want to emphasize it because we've been asked sort of, how is this different from existing demand response programs? And by the way, we spent some time in the report summarizing the existing demand response programs, and they've obviously made very meaningful contributions in some markets. One of the differences, I think, generally is that most of the loads that participate, especially the large loads, which are about 70% of participants in demand response programs, most of those loads are treated as firm loads for the purposes of resource adequacy planning and interconnection and transmission planning. And they opt to participate in demand response for economic purposes, given the, the associated economic incentives. What we're talking about here can include that, but it's a little different in that we're talking about, pulling up the considerations earlier in the planning process from the beginning and recognizing, the profile of the load and its capabilities before an interconnection study and a transmission study and a capacity expansion plan is developed to accommodate that new load. And that is, we think, a bit different than the existing programs we've seen. And it does arguably require a little bit more of a sophisticated approach to system planning, and in some ways similar to, we've done integrated resource planning sort of on the generation side now for a couple decades in different jurisdictions. Most recently, there's been this significant push on proactive transmission planning as part of the integrated resource planning process, or in parallel, right, on a proactive basis via the transmission planning collaboratives or the RTOs. And now we're talking about trying to integrate this piece of it for the large loads. So we'll call it there. We're right at time. Want to thank everyone so much for participating and for your great questions. And we'll look forward to being in touch.